Taxi drivers of Reddit, have anyone actually jumped into your taxi and screamed, "Follow that car"? If yes, what happened? Post 1. Oh goodness, I truly have a rather unpleasant anecdote concerning this. I used to be a cab driver for my uncle's company. One day, a man hopped into my taxi and, with a somewhat reassuring tone, simply stated, "Just tail that car." He insisted it wasn't anything serious or problematic. However, the situation quickly escalated. When the other vehicle eventually halted, he swiftly exited my cab, raced towards the car we had been pursuing, and forcefully extracted the driver. What followed was a brutal assault, as he repeatedly struck the man's face with considerable force. I immediately got out of my vehicle, shouting at him and vehemently calling him an absolute jerk for having deliberately misled me. He then turned his aggression toward me, confronting me closely, threatening to viciously beat me up as well, spewing a barrage of racial slurs in my direction before bolting away from the scene. The individual who was subjected to the punching had his nasal bone fractured. The most peculiar aspect of this whole disturbing event was that the injured man claimed to have no recognition whatsoever of his attacker. It was an utterly baffling and disturbing experience. Post 2. This isn't entirely analogous, but I did once experience a situation where someone abruptly entered my car, despite the fact I wasn't operating as a taxi. I was casually driving along a street in Boston, completely immersed in my own thoughts, when I came to a stop at a red light. Suddenly, my passenger side door was flung open and an individual clambered inside. I was utterly taken aback, so much so that I had no opportunity to even react. For some inexplicable reason, the notion of feeling alarmed or concerned about this unexpected intruder simply didn't cross my mind. Upon observing that it was an elderly woman, I instinctively maintained my composure. Without a moment's hesitation, she declared in a very pronounced Russian accent, "You take me home, please." So, I began driving. I inquired about her residence, but she merely instructed, "Keep proceeding. I will tell you when to halt." It was at that juncture that it dawned on me she likely had dementia and probably mistook me for someone she knew or maybe even a legitimate taxi service. But no, that wasn't the case. After only a few minutes of conversation, it became abundantly clear that this woman had simply selected the first available car she saw, entered it, and requested a ride. Throughout our approximately 10-minute journey, she posed questions about my life. I was currently enrolled in college, pursuing psychology, and when I conveyed this to her, she remarked, "You will make an excellent psychologist. Very nice boy." This brought a significant smile to my face. My grandparents had all passed away either before my birth or during my early childhood, so I don't believe I had ever received such a warm compliment from an elderly person. It felt genuinely warm-hearting. Finally, we arrived at an apartment complex, and she instructed me to pull over. As I shifted the car into park, she turned to me and expressed, "Thank you for driving me today." I reassured her that it was absolutely no trouble at all and extended my best wishes. Her final words to me as she exited the vehicle were, "Very good boy. Good luck with your studies." After a brief pause to process the unusual encounter, I drove away and decided to simply let the experience be. It had been such a casual and comfortable interaction that I resisted the urge to immediately text my friends to recount what had transpired. It felt as though doing so might have somehow diminished its value or transformed it into a mere novelty. It was simply so natural, and I went along with it. She is quite likely no longer alive at this point, but I sincerely hope she enjoyed the remainder of her days. Godspeed, my Russian grandma I had for a day.
Post 3. I'm actually a taxi operator. Specifically, I drive a bike taxi or pedicab. I was simply lingering on a street corner when one of my colleagues secured a fare that took them directly across the intersection. Suddenly, a man approached me and curtly instructed me to follow that cab but maintain a significant distance. This individual appeared to either be currently serving in the military or a veteran. His demeanor, his precise haircut, and his general attitude all suggested it. He was even wearing one of those earbuds, much like the agents depicted in The Matrix. He truly exuded an aura of being highly professional and competent, yet simultaneously possessing an air of complete indifference. So in that moment, I felt born for this specific task. As a child, I had devoured every Tom Clancy novel, every book detailing spycraft during World War II and the Cold War, and literally every spy movie ever produced. I instinctively kept a distance of roughly 100 yards, and then whenever their vehicle rounded a bend or approached a light or intersection, I had memorized all the traffic signals in the area. I would accelerate to ensure we passed through the same light, albeit a moment or two later than them. At one point, another car pulled up alongside us, and a different individual exchanged places with the original passenger, and we continued our pursuit. After approximately 12 city blocks, the pedicab ahead of us pulled over, and my passenger instructed me to do the same. He then handed me $20 for what was essentially a $12 fare, although I honestly would have undertaken the ride for free, simply to fulfill my childhood fantasy from when I was 9 years old. It was most likely just local police officers conducting some sort of surveillance, but a person can certainly dream, can't they? Post 4. Oh, I'm not a taxi driver myself, but I was the passenger in a story that feels similarly cliched to those you might hear. Back in my younger days, when I was deeply involved as an actor and simultaneously grappling with severe drug addiction and alcoholism, which, let's be honest, sometimes felt indistinguishable, I had a director issue a serious threat. She would recast my role just a week before the show's premiere if I was late to rehearsal even one more time. To truly put that into perspective, recasting a major part once rehearsals have commenced is generally considered unprecedented, and to do so this late in the rehearsal process is almost unimaginable. She was, quite frankly, utterly fed up with my behavior. On this particular day, I was, as per my usual habit, running considerably behind schedule. I had a mere 5 minutes to reach rehearsal. The options were a 10-minute walk or a 5-minute drive. I promptly hailed a cab, swiftly entered, and declared, "I need you to take me to this address, and if you can, I genuinely need you to step on it." The driver immediately broke into a broad smile and exclaimed, "I've always yearned to hear that precise phrase." What ensued was a scene straight out of a high-octane action film. He promptly slammed the pedal to the metal. Within a mere 10 seconds, we were accelerating rapidly, nearing 65 miles per hour on a city street with a posted 30 mph speed limit. We were expertly weaving through traffic, clipping yellow lights with a proximity that was far too close for comfort, and generally maneuvering this taxi in an extraordinarily reckless and haphazard manner. I was utterly dumbfounded. My eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and sheer terror. I simply was unable to process that he had so literally followed my request, or that this improbable scenario was genuinely unfolding. I honestly believed I was on the brink of death. Yet, paradoxically, it remains to this day the most exhilarating cab ride of my entire existence. I arrived at rehearsal a full 2 minutes early.
Post 5. A friend of mine, who works as a taxi driver, experienced something quite similar to this cliche. An elderly man hurriedly entered his taxi and loudly pointed, insisting they follow a red Toyota. This gentleman never bothered to explain his reasons for the pursuit. He merely attempted to frantically make a call to some unknown destination. My friend repeatedly asked if they should contact the police, but the man simply waved him off, gesturing emphatically to continue following the car. They circled around the town for a considerable period, eventually arriving in front of a house where the target vehicle finally parked. As the red Toyota came to a complete stop, the elderly man exclaimed, "Hold on a moment, I'll pay," and promptly exited the taxi. An elderly lady then emerged from the red Toyota, and the man, who was evidently her husband, began to shout furiously, "Why did you abandon me at the mall?" The woman, in turn, started gesticulating wildly and screaming back, "What on earth are you yelling about? You're right here." She then calmly walked inside the house as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. The man returned to the taxi, paid for the ride, and was apologetic about the entire ordeal. My friend initially suspected they might be pursuing a burglar or involved in something illicit, but it ultimately turned out that the lady had simply forgotten her husband at the shopping mall. It was a somewhat amusing situation in a way, yet also rather poignant, as my friend remarked, alluding to the possibility of dementia. Post 6. I was a taxi driver for a summer in a rather lively party resort. One particular night, two guys abruptly leapt into my cab and collectively shouted, "Follow that car!" It happened to be another taxi, and I recognized the driver, so I readily complied. It turned out that one of their buddies was extremely inebriated and had simply decided to head back to their hotel without bothering to inform them. The two passengers had only seen their friends stumbling out of the club in a drunken state and wrongly assumed he was heading to a strip club without them. In reality, he was indeed going to their shared hotel as he was completely hammered. Another time, three young women jumped into my vehicle and likewise instructed me to follow a particular car. The vehicle in question was a black sedan with heavily tinted rear windows. In my honest opinion, it didn't strike me as particularly suspicious at the time. We proceeded to follow the car for about 15 minutes, leaving the resort area and venturing into a nearby forest. At this point, the girls in my taxi began to freak out because one of their friends, also a girl, had been observed entering that car earlier. Well, as it transpired, their friend had simply connected with some guy at the club they had previously been at, and she was on the verge of engaging in some private activities when we unexpectedly pulled up right alongside them. It was truly the most peculiar summer I've ever experienced.
Post 7. Something quite similar to this occurred to me approximately 2 decades ago. I wasn't a taxi driver, but I was driving along a main road when I observed an individual running around wielding a baseball bat, and then, in the distance, I noticed some police cars parked on a side street. My younger self, being somewhat impulsive, decided that I absolutely wanted to get involved in whatever was unfolding. So, I turned down the side street and located a police officer on foot, a considerable distance away from his patrol vehicle. I promptly informed him about the baseball bat guy, and he immediately communicated via his radio. I presume he received an instant update on his radio because he then assessed the distance to his car and inquired, "Can you give me a ride down the road?" My immediate thought was, "Hell yeah," and I told him to jump in. He does, and I am seriously driving through back roads with a uniformed police officer riding shotgun, issuing directions to me while simultaneously communicating on his radio. This lasted for only about 2 minutes, after which he exited my vehicle to continue pursuing the individual on foot. It wasn't a particularly satisfying conclusion to the story, as I never actually discovered what eventually happened. But darn it, that's my story, and I stick to it. Post 8. I've been operating a cab for about a year now, typically working the evening to early morning shift, from 6 p.m. to 3 a.m. One night, my dispatcher radioed me to an address, approximately 5 minutes before the conclusion of my shift. After a short 2-minute drive, it's a small city, I pulled up into the circular driveway just as another car was speeding out the opposite end and tearing away. Suddenly, the largest man I have ever witnessed in my life came barreling out of the house like a raging bull and leapt into my cab. He urgently demanded, "Did you see the car that just left? Follow it." I quickly caught up to the vehicle and continued to tail it onto the highway. As soon as it merged onto the highway, the car promptly activated its hazard lights and accelerated to maximum speed. The mountain of a man in my backseat then informed me, "My wife is in labor and my father-in-law is driving." He then instructed me to catch up and offered a $200 incentive. So, naturally, I floored it, reaching approximately 90 miles per hour in a designated 45 mile per hour zone. It turned out his father-in-law was the city's police chief and had already radioed for an official escort. I glanced in my rearview mirror and observed 4 police cars about a mile behind us, rapidly gaining ground. I momentarily panicked and almost began to slow down when my passenger reassured me that they were in fact our escort. True enough, 2 of the police cars shot past me as if I were standing still, despite the fact that I was still traveling at 90 miles per hour. The other 2 pulled in behind me and we still had another 2 to 3 miles to cover. Another minute or 2 passed and we come screeching to a halt at the emergency room entrance where 2 nurses were already waiting outside. The man thanked me and handed me the promised money and quickly exited the car. Post 9. This isn't quite what the original poster asked, but it's very close. A colleague of mine, who is a police officer in the UK, was on foot patrol when he witnessed a robbery occurring in the distance. A driver was forcibly pulled from their car, and the robbers then drove off in the stolen vehicle. My friend reacted precisely as described in the original question. He hailed a civilian car and exclaimed, "Follow that car!" The driver of the civilian car apparently became extremely enthusiastic, trying desperately to keep pace with the fleeing robbers, all while a uniformed police officer was in his passenger seat, providing a running commentary to his base via radio. Unfortunately, they eventually lost sight of the stolen car, and my colleague asked his driver to pull over. He then exited the vehicle and allowed the driver to depart without bothering to ask for his personal details. As the driver drove off into the distance, my friend suddenly realized he had left his police truncheon, a bat-like weapon, commonly called a peg in UK police slang, on the dashboard of the civilian's car. Fortunately, the driver later called in and the truncheon was successfully returned. I have no idea what eventually became of the robbers, the stolen car, or the victim, I'm afraid. Post 10. I'm not a taxi driver, but when I was 18 years old, driving home late one night in Seattle, I was rear-ended by another driver. When I attempted to contact the police from a public payphone, this was back in 1992, so mobile phones weren't common, the man who hit me pulled a gun on me and ordered me to get into his trunk. In a moment of sheer panic and adrenaline, I managed to knock him down and fled the scene. Luckily, there happened to be a taxi waiting at a red light nearby, so I was able to leap into it and scream, "Drive, just drive!" Without a moment's hesitation, the driver immediately sped off. The taxi driver stayed with me at a nearby 7-Eleven convenience store until the police arrived. I'll never forget his kindness and quick thinking. I was incredibly shaken up by the whole ordeal. If you happen to be out there reading this now, thank you, taxi driver dude. You were a true lifesaver that night. Got your own wild taxi or Uber story? Drop it in the comments. We'd love to hear how your ride went off the rails.